tremendous attention has been focused on the decline of civil discourse on America's campuses and in society. Flyers being ripped down from approved bulletin boards, speakers being shouted down, disinvitations, deplatforming. These incidents have a familiar trope, examples of we support free speech as long as we agree with it, a perversion of the First Amendment. But that's not what we're going to talk about on this panel. Today, our focus is on the work that's being done to forge productive solutions to the kinds of problems that we're seeing. The center has brought together leaders from across the country whose efforts to improve discourse and dialogue are inventive and cutting edge. And I'm going to just get right to it and start by having each of our panelists describe the work that they are doing. First, we have Ilana Redstone Akresh. She's an associate professor, Department of Sociology at University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and she's currently teaching a pilot course titled Free Speech, Viewpoint Diversity in Higher Education, AKA Bigots and Snowflakes, Living in a World Where Everyone Else is Wrong. And I have to tell you, I have told Ilana this. I wish I lived closer so that I could come and audit that course. So why don't you kick it off for us and tell us why this class and why now?
Yeah, so the class was something that I started to think about a year ago, and it just seemed like an obvious next step to sort of dive right in and try and address some of these questions head on. And it's, I guess, I'm teaching the Bigots and Snowflakes class at the same time I'm teaching another course in social problems, which is so the Bigots and Snowflakes class is a pilot class. The social problems class is a more standard staple of a sociology department. But I'm teaching it from a heterodox political perspective, which is not how those if anyone's taken any course like that, it's not how those courses are usually taught. And so it's been interesting sort of teaching them at the same time. But the Bigots and Snowflakes class is really trying to get students to think about not so much free speech specifically, but more about viewpoint diversity and sort of what they're learning and how they're being taught. Obviously, there's enormous self-selection about who is, choosing to sign up for that class in the first place. But it has been great. The students are very engaged. Again, I'll just say that a lot of what I do, both in writing and in the classes, is trying to look at what's going on in higher education that's essentially upstream of problems related to free speech and civility and sort of what's underpinning the whole enterprise. So I can talk more about that.
Yeah, do you want to just give a couple quick examples and then we'll keep going?
Examples from the class?
Yeah, just things that are what you see as upstream.
So I mean, the things that, I guess I can just, this is a lot of what I said, John Villasenor, who will be on later. So we're writing a book about academic discourse. And so the idea, the easiest way to say it is the idea in that book is that there are essentially a set of unspoken beliefs that underpin the academic enterprise that that obviously is unspoken, they're sort of unacknowledged. And those are sort of held up by indirect and direct effects of social media that really shape everything that's taught, that shapes the research that gets done, what isn't taught, the research that doesn't get done. I could just say really quickly the beliefs that we talk about in the book. The first one is a belief that any action that's taken to undermine traditional power structures is an indisputably good thing. And we're not trying to defend traditional power structures. We're just making the observation that this is a belief. The second one is a belief that all differences in group outcomes are exclusively due to discrimination. And the third is a belief in the primacy of identity along the lines that we normally think about identity. And so the point is not really to make, it's mostly just to make what's been implicit explicit and say that these are a set of beliefs, because if you can do that, then in theory you could have a conversation about what would it be like to not have these beliefs.
Thank you. I'm going to go down to the end of here to talk to introduce the wonderful Lara Schwartz, who's the director of the project on civil discourse right here in DC at American University. And I'm going to ask her to talk about why this project was created and what its goals are.
Sure. Why the project was created and what its goals are. Project was created because speech matters, right? The title of this conference isn't Speech Meh, which would be a fun hashtag. It's Speech Matters. Speech is powerful. There's a reason the First Amendment is the First Amendment, right? I'm sure there are lots of, all the legal historians that are like, no, well, actually, Lara, it's because of this. It matters. Speech matters. Speech is powerful. It's the most powerful thing we have. But how do we use it? One of the things about college, I teach at American University School of Public Affairs, so I teach undergrads largely, which is wonderful. These are people who are learning to do college, learning to engage in the space that is college on the fly, most of which, by the way, the rules and norms of it are implicit. And we all know what they are, like obscenity. I'll know it when I see it. I'll know college when I see it. But teachers out here, we actually should be explicit. So they're learning to do this, and they're learning, in the case of the School of Public Affairs, they're learning to talk about, my con law course is like God, guns, and gays. So we're doing everything that's controversial. That's what School of Public Affairs is supposed to be about. That's what my classes are supposed to be about. So you have these young people in, for some of them, the most diverse community they've ever lived in, and some the least so, smushed together, living together, working together, studying enormously provocative things together under enormous social pressure, with only the brilliant social experiment in civic discourse and productivity that is America as a backdrop for them. And the question is, what are they going to do with their voices? How are they going to use their speech? That's the most powerful thing they have. What choices are they going to make? What are they going to make of that opportunity? The free speech answer, nobody can stop me, it's pretty short. It's not a question of how. It doesn't answer anything about what you're supposed to do with your time in college or your time in our civic enterprise, in our civitas, our world, our community. That all that is you can't stop me. And so the point of the program is to get people talking about what they would like to do with their voice, how they would like to use it productively in this world, in speaking, in listening, and sharing, in choosing what to read, what to study, how to engage, and what to contribute. And instead of asking this question of what can you say, which is the free speech question, we look to our sort of founding philosopher, Dr. Ian Malcolm from Jurassic Park. Your scientists were so preoccupied with whether they could, they didn't stop to think whether they should. So we're the program about whether you should.
Okay, thank you. Steve Schultz is general counsel at Purdue University, and he is the creator of Purdue's freshman free speech orientation, which I highly recommend. Purdue is the first institution to create a program, freshman orientation program, solely dedicated to freedom of speech. And I'd love for Steve to tell us about that program, how it was formed, the goals, and how you got buy-in.
Sure. Yeah, we don't have a clever name for it yet. We probably should brand it something, but it is part of our 5-day first-year student orientation program called Boiler Gold Rush. That's the overall program. It really is a direct outgrowth of our board having adopted the Chicago principles, our version, the Purdue Statements of Commitment, Purdue's Statement of Commitment to Freedom of Expression in May of 15. And that really started, or continued a conversation, I should say. The conversation really started about a year prior, or several months prior, and it was sparked by some really bright student leaders who happened to go to a lecture by Greg Lukianoff of FIRE on our campus, and he got to thinking, why doesn't Purdue, why aren't we a green light campus? And so he lobbied, and eventually we were able to successfully identify the policy fixes that we need. We had a few of them. But in one fell swoop, our board both adopted the Chicago principles and amended those policies in May of 15. And it's continued, really kick-started this conversation, put it on steroids, about, well, what does this renewed commitment to freedom of expression mean at Purdue? And the faculty in particular were like, well, the board didn't really come and engage in shared governance when they decided to adopt this statement. Sorry. But they nonetheless picked up the torch and, to their credit, added a lot of constructive ideas about how that would look and how we should go about acting on it. In particular, I think there might have been some worry that, hey, what does this mean? Are we all of a sudden going to open up the floodgates and let students say whatever they want in class, disrupt class, et cetera? We quickly pointed to the fact that, look, if you read the principles themselves, they're sort of self-contained, and they acknowledge that we have the ability to regulate our spaces, have fora governed by time, place, and manner. We have the ability to restrict expression that's not protected. We even honor civility and mutual respect as aspirational values in the statement. So that kind of was addressed in the conversations, but their one suggestion was, but we need to deal with the fact, and Chancellor Gilman mentioned it as one of his criteria earlier, the fact that our students are coming to campus without a firm grounding in constitutionalism and our rights under the First Amendment. So if we're going to have this thing, we need to create some kind of orientation so that they know what they're getting into and so that we can sort of manage their expectations. So by August of 16, we'll be in our 4th year, I guess our 4th performance, we have this hour-long session. Usually it's about an hour and 10 minutes. We deliver it to 6,000 students, 3,000 in 2 sessions on the first night of the orientation. So we've got still a captive, excited audience. And we use a combination of skits, a panel discussion like this that sort of reacts to the skits and makes observations about the First Amendment principles, free speech principles that are demonstrated in the scenarios. And then we have video clips of outside experts, President Obama coming in and talking about why free speech is so important. And our goals are really threefold: to impart to the incoming students why free speech is not just required for us as a state institution, but why it will be an integral part of their Purdue education. We describe, again, the scenarios that they might expect to encounter while they're on campus and what they should expect by way of an institutional response when those situations occur. And then finally, what options they have and what resources they have when encountering speech that they find offensive. And it's really in that context that the topic of civility comes up.
Okay, thank you. And I have lots of follow-ups, but I want to introduce Katja Armstead, who's the Assistant Vice Chancellor and Dean of Students at UCSB. I know there's UCSB people out here.
Gauchos.
Gauchos. Would you talk about the work that you and your team are doing? Katja just did an amazing panel at NASPA, if anybody was there at the Los Angeles conference, talking about some of the really inventive work that they're doing to increase dialogue on campus.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, I have the unique privilege of being part of a team of deans in terms of the UC system, and a few of them are here, UCLA and Berkeley. And so I think we learn a lot from each other and how to respond to students' concerns. And I think approach that we take collectively is that we're there for students, we're advocating for students. And so we're always looking for ways in which we can provide opportunities for them to engage in civil discourse, where we can make them feel included on the campus. So at UC Santa Barbara, some of the initiatives that we have taken on include, following the lead of UC San Diego, we bring in the National Conflict Resolution Center, who provide a 3-hour workshop called The Art of Inclusive Communication. So if you want to be an officer of a registered campus org, or if you want your org to be registered, at least one of the officers has to go through this workshop, which I think has really, looking at, this is our first year, UC San Diego has been doing it for several years, looking at the data afterwards and how many students were surprised how much they learned about difference and how better they can engage in conversation. It was really powerful. We also worked with UC Santa Cruz and UC Davis, working with the company EverFi to create a workshop, an online diversity workshop for incoming students. And so all new freshmen and transfer students have to go through this 1-hour workshop online, and they have to already do one for sexual violence and one for alcohol and other drugs. And so it just folded right in, and that was received really well, and I really tried to push it out across the entire campus, letting faculty know, hey, this is what students are doing, maybe you should go through it too, maybe you'll learn something, and continue the conversation in the classroom as well as staff and administrators. And that has been received overwhelmingly well. I've even had academic deans say, I'm going to have all my graduate students actually take this online workshop. So just creating those kind of opportunities so that students can engage in healthier, more civic dialogue, because they are learning a lot. They are engaged or confronted with some really challenging things, information, things that are happening on campus, speakers on campus. Additionally, 2 years ago, my colleague Miles Ashlock and I were asked to present to student affairs interns during a training and asked us to address free speech and campus climate. And so we created a pretty provocative workshop that was about an hour and a half. and really pushed them and got them to think about free speech. And it went really well. It went so well that I even shared it with some colleagues at UC Santa Cruz, and they recently had me up talking to their staff about how to engage students in this area. So those are some of the things that we've done.
So, I mean, I think one point before we move on to other questions is just there's so many people in the room to know that there's already great work that's being done, and to the extent that we can elevate each other's work and use each other's work, I think that's so important. If the center can play a role in doing that, I think that's great. One of the things I've really been doing a lot of my own learning about is that civil discourse can really mean a lot of different things to different people. And I want to ask each of our panelists what civil discourse means to you and how you integrate your understanding of civil discourse into your work. And I'm going to go the opposite direction and start with Lara.
Civil discourse is productive. Discourse that can lead to a result where something is better than before the discourse happened, I would call civil discourse. That means that there is the potential that civil discourse might actually hurt and be uncomfortable, like medical procedures, like working out. But civil discourse is productive, right? And that which is wasting everyone's time, I would argue, is inherently uncivil.
Thank you. Steve.
Sure. To me, it's a social interaction where viewpoints are expressed and debated in a manner that exhibits mutual respect and what I just recently finished Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff's book, what they call the intellectual virtues, curiosity, open-mindedness, and this intellectual humility. The notion, and it was expressed earlier, I think by Frank Bruni, that always recognize that as convinced as you are that you are right, you might be wrong. And so you're receptive to hearing other points of view. And of course, empathy, trying to get inside the head of the person that you're interacting with in this discourse exercise will help you understand their point of view, and maybe you can sharpen your own point of view and learn from them as well.
Thank you. Empathy, humility, mutual respect, things I think we all should have. Katya, what does it mean for you?
Listening to each other. Just real quickly, one of the things that we do in the workshop that I shared earlier was we started off with putting people in pairs and having them do a discussion, but one person's speaking and one person is just listening, and we give them some really hard topics. For example, Black Lives Matter, Blue Lives Matter. And we say you have to speak affirmative, positive about what role you're assigned. They listen to each other. And then I give them a few seconds to kind of like, okay, I said this stuff and I'm not sure it's what I really meant. But so much learning happens, and because we debrief afterwards, where how much were you just thinking about how you were going to respond, how much were you really listening, notice your body language, were you getting heated, and just even that exercise of listening to each other and talking it through, I think makes a huge difference.
Okay. Ilana, how about you?
I guess so when we think about civil discourse and the idea of civility, like it really comes into play when we're talking about sort of third rail topics, right? Like nobody's worried about civility if we're talking about, something totally benign.
The weather.
So, right, the weather. But if you're talking about race, gender, immigration, class, right? So that's where the questions about civility come in. So, I guess it's being able to have a conversation about, from a wide range of viewpoints. I think that what Lara said makes sense, that it is not about necessarily being comfortable. It doesn't mean that people are comfortable. I think what Stephen said is well about, I think intellectual humility is enormous. I think we all could do with more of it. But just to give, I guess I could give two examples of sort of when it works and an example of when it worked, and I think an example of when it didn't work. Although even with the when it didn't work, it's not clear what you could do differently. So the one where it did work was, and this is in the Bigots and Snowflakes class. So there was one class, I don't want to go into a ton of detail, but several weeks ago there was an incident with Liam Neeson, where some people probably paid attention to it, where he gave an interview for a publication in the UK to publicize a movie that I guess is now out. But anyway, he was talking about an experience that he had you can go and watch the clip if you haven't seen it.
But
we
not
were
right
talking-
now.
Yeah, not right now. But he was, anyway, he was talking about an experience that he had about sort of that generated sort of what he drew upon for his own feelings of revenge. And it was, you know, indisputably sort of very kind of disturbing. Just from an anger management perspective, it was kind of disturbing. But, you know, after that happened, like in that class, that's what the students wanted to talk about. And I actually just kind of let the conversation go, and we ended up talking about it for the full hour and 20 minutes because it was very productive, right? And they did not agree. There were students who felt like, you know, that he should be sort of canceled or, you know, or whatever. There were students who, and then there were students who seemed to see it more in an individual incident kind of way, like he has, you know, redeemed himself and sort of thinking, which brings in, you know, a conversation about redemption and all of that. So that was, I think, an example of where it worked really well. You know, I guess the example where it didn't work would be, you know, so this actually came up in the social problems class. There was a recent, Martina Navrachilova's recent op-ed, right? So she, in recent weeks, she wrote an op-ed. So I know there's a lot of young people here. Very famous tennis player. Hopefully you know who she is. Also iconic because she came out as a lesbian at a time when it was not, you know, acceptable to do so, or far less acceptable. So anyway, so she wrote an op-ed for the Times of London where she took a position as a former professional athlete. She took a position that trans women should not be allowed to participate in women's sports, and that it was unfair to women in the women competing in those sports. And so, you know, we read the op-ed in the class, and we were having a conversation about it. And you know, a couple of students would say, you know, well, maybe she could have said, maybe she could have, you know, phrased or prefaced it a little bit differently, or, you know, trying to think about the op-ed, you know. But at the end of the day, like sort of after a few minutes of conversation, I said, well, you know, is there any way that she could hold this opinion and you wouldn't view her as transphobic, you know? And they're all like, no. And I don't think that, in their defense, I don't think they were necessarily saying that was a good thing. I think they were making the observation that that was it. That was the end of the road. And so that, I guess, to me, that's sort of like, that's a failure, I think. And so, yeah, I don't know. Those would be two examples.
Those are great. To kind of piggyback off that, you know, I kind of feel like I grew up with the concept of civil and civility as polite and courteous, and none of you is raising that, but I would be surprised if I wasn't the only person who feels that way. And there's been a lot of writing about how that idea of civility can reinforce the status quo and can work to marginalize the views of groups, especially those groups that have been underrepresented. And I wanted to know if anybody wants to share any thoughts about that and how you work to make sure that doesn't happen in the work that you're doing.
So, yeah, think about if you are trying to get the attention of someone who's, you know, handing out life vests, right? And the person the furthest away from whoever's handing out life vests in an emergency has to jump up and down and scream, "Give me the life vest," right? And the person very, very close to whoever's handing out the life vest can be like, "Pardon me, I would very much not like to drown today." And the chances are the cheapest seats are the ones furthest from the guy with the life vest, right? And I think that there are so many circumstances that are like that, where your options of how to get yourself helped and heard are limited and different, depending on how powerful you are and how many resources you have. And so requiring of people a certain degree of non-anger and niceness, I think it's a means of control. It also privileges people who aren't being, to use legalese, screwed over, right? People often are angry and forceful when they've been hurt, right? Hurt dog hollers, right? So privileging a certain degree of self-mastery in the way that you engage, you pretty much putting your thumb on the scale in front of the people who already had it pretty good. And I think that's immensely, immensely challenging. There are different kinds of discomfort, and some of them are productive and some of them aren't. A student hearing that she might have privilege of some kind is often uncomfortable. Being told, you know, the fact that you can take this unpaid internship puts you ahead of my student who's working at Dunkin' Donuts to pay her expected family contribution. And so no, I am not hiring you over her for this job because your resume is better. and I actually hope you're learning from me as I tell you this. That student hearing that might be uncomfortable, and I think that is a productive discomfort. It's very different from the discomfort that another student might feel being sort of informed or accused that she's only here because of race preferences or something. So I think, politeness can be good, but I don't know that we've gotten all that far with politeness. I think it makes it a really easy, convenient excuse to be unkind and to reinforce oppression. And I think this conventional wisdom around politeness, and the real big problem here is that you're insulting a dead senator and not that children are in cages. I don't think we're doing a great job.
Thank you. Anybody else want to jump in on this one?
Students are so smart.
Yes. Let's not for that.
And they have made so many changes on our campuses and have created some really wonderful programs and spaces, and they haven't done it by being polite. So I just can't even imagine. So I am definitely an advocate for supporting students, and I see myself on campus as someone who will support them and also let them know, you're about to cross a line. Do you know the consequences? I'm just letting you know, and just helping and guiding them. But I don't see politeness as part of civil discourse necessarily anymore.
Okay, either of you? Or
I guess I would just say that one of the things we try to illustrate in the panel discussion, actually responding to one of the skits, there's a dispute that happens in a residence hall as part of the scenario. And we talk about the fact that students have options. And I take the point that anger is sometimes necessary to get your point across. We also talk about the point that sometimes it may not be the best way to win friends and influence people. But I take your point that to bring about change, sometimes it's needed. But I think we can express anger and still not be disagreeable when we're disagreeing, if that makes sense.
you have anything?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I don't think, politeness and courtesy, those seem like good things. I mean, and I do think that there's a piece of this where the question is sort of overlaid and infused with race and identity in a way that it doesn't necessarily have to be. You could actually separate those two things. So I think there's a piece of it there. I can fully appreciate that you can't have social movements with just people being nice to one, right? Like that's not how things change. I get that. I mean, I guess part of it depends on, in terms of sort of righteous anger, part of it depends on what your goals are. I mean, are your goals to have, I think that, the level of righteous anger and the sort of moral certitude that we see now, whether you like it or not, one of the byproducts of that is polarization, is resentment. I mean, it is. And so, make an informed decision about how you want to present yourself, and then understand, I just mean in general, understand sort of what the consequences are. So,
Well, I think it's really interesting. It even came up this morning in the student dialogue we had, where we were talking about protesting, and one student shared that they wished that students, when Milo came to campus, would not give him the attention that he craves. That's really giving, is it oxygen to fire? Oh, yeah, that's right. Okay. So, and then someone else stood up and said, I actually disagree. I feel like it's my right as a student to protest, and why should I, and they were basically talking about two different ways to respond to speech, and it was very interesting. You all represent, in the classroom, in administration, with students. What do you see generally as the role of either faculty or administrators in furthering civil discourse?
I can start with
Please.
things. So I guess I would just like to say, I could give another example, and then I just wanted to say something about administrators. But for faculty, I think that we could do a lot more, particularly those of us that teach in the social sciences. I think we could do a lot more and do a lot better to sort of step outside of our narrow framework. So just to give an example, Some of you may remember from sometime in early January, there was an ad from Gillette that so everybody was talking about this ad about, and it had, I don't think they used the words toxic masculinity in it, but that was essentially what it was about. And so we talked about this in one of my, actually in both classes, but in one of the classes, so for the one person in the back of the room who hadn't seen the ad, we showed the 1 minute and 20 seconds of the ad, and then we talked about it. And so I asked the class, and I said, what is it that people might like about this ad? What do people like about it? And so, hands go up, and then people talk about how it's sort of breaking down gender norms, and it's, teaching men that there's, they don't have to solve problems with anger, and so and all of the positive things that come out of the ad. And then I said, well, okay, well, what might people, because obviously it was very controversial, and I said, well, what might people object to about this ad? And a couple of hands go up, and so, and the 2 or 3 hands that go up, essentially what they're saying is, well, somebody might object to this ad if they are really attached to traditional gender norms. So, sort of backward-facing, kind of knuckle-dragging, just wanting to hold on to traditional gender norms. And I said, yep. I said, that makes total sense. I said, absolutely, people could object to this ad for that reason. I said, I'm sure there are people who object to this ad, and the idea about it, or the idea of the ad for that reason. And I said, what else? I said, what else? I said, what else do you have? I said, give me something else. And so they can't come up with, which isn't, again, it's not, these are really bright students. And so then we kind of talk about, well, what are some of the other reasons that people might object to this ad, right? So what about, what does it mean to pathologize or to potentially pathologize? And I'm very clear that, like, you don't have to agree with this. I just want you to think about it. So what does it mean to pathologize traditionally masculine traits? What if there are biological differences between men and women that matter here? So in the case of aggression or something, and you are sort of making clinical traits that are to a certain extent biological, and so and they're just listening. And so in terms of what faculty can do, in the absence of that kind of conversation, the only frame of reference and I don't think they're unique in this respect, the only frame of reference that those students have walking out of that class, if they meet whatever the version of Gillette's ad is 5 years from now, is that it's somebody who's clinging to traditional gender norms. And I think that is, frankly, a disservice to students. So that's, I guess, an example of where I think faculty could do better. I think administrators, and I've never been an administrator, and I don't want to minimize how difficult that role is. I'm sure it is very difficult, and so it's easy for me to sit here and criticize. But I think that administrators, from where I sit, I think administrators could do a lot more to not capitulate to pressure. Really, the example, I think a prime example recently is Professor Sullivan at Harvard recently, who signed on to the Harvey Weinstein defense team, and essentially, the administration just, sided with the students, basically, and sort of in listening to them and creating spaces where they felt protected. Whereas, they could have taken, another option would be to take that opportunity and say, you know what, no matter how odious the person, no matter how repulsive their offense is, everybody deserves a defense. That's part of the legal system in this country. And it doesn't mean that we're endorsing, Harvey Weinstein or anybody like Harvey, that would just be another reaction. So I think there's a lot of space for different, and there's just endless examples like that. Yeah.
Okay.
So we start my introduction to communication, legal institutions, economics, and government class. That's a first-year class, multidisciplinary government course, the theme of which is speech. We start by practicing saying, I don't know, in front of each other. I ask them to ask me, the toughest question. I'll use my little quizzes that I have from them about, the person who says they know nothing about sports. I'm like, who was the MVP of last year's World Series? Something. We practice saying, I don't know, and then we practice finding answers to things. We have to develop, I think, as teachers, but there are a lot of students in the room, which is fantastic. We have to develop a shared vocabulary about what we're trying to accomplish in a classroom space, in a learning community. I thought when I started teaching that it was so important to get to the content, that if we wasted time on things like, what should be in your paper? And what are we doing here? That I wasn't being rigorous enough. We wouldn't learn enough about our Constitution or how Congress works, which is no. That was fast. We have plenty of time to talk about civil discourse. And what I have come to understand is that shared objectives, talking about what do we want to get done here, what are our goals for the classroom itself, and I have the power as a professor to set those goals to an extent, so that's power exercise. But I do give some of that authority and responsibility over to the student, ask them to develop their own goals, both each individually and for the class as a whole. What is it you want to do? And I ask them to develop goals around their discourse, what kind of listener they would like to be. Do you want to participate more? Do you want to get better at hearing critiques of yourself? Do you want to get better at engaging with other people's ideas? Do you want to get better at standing up for yourself? And we actually find ways that they can track and prove that they've managed that, and it's part of their grade. And I ask them to give me a sense of what they'd like me to offer into the space. So we set goals together, and then we work together to figure out ways that we're going to accomplish them. I'm authentic, and I think professors should be. There's a lot in the kind of hysteria regarding free speech on campus, which I think is completely overblown. I've worked at other places, and colleges are places of more intense debate and contention than anywhere else. You can't walk through the sort of office atrium of your tech company and with like all manner of different political symbols all over the place and start leafleting at your friends. You know, that's how college works. But right, I mean, it's strange, this idea, and everybody who whines about college students being such snowflakes, they go home to their safe space known as their house, right, where nobody disapproves of their opinions except their kids. Mine's in 9th grade and has a PhD in gender studies from Tumblr University. My life is trash. Right. We talk about what we want to accomplish, including how we're going to communicate effectively. And one of the things that we do is we're very authentic about our opinions, including my own. My students have used the Googles. They know I worked for the vast left-wing conspiracy before I became a professor. And we talk about that, and I ask them very explicitly, you know, show me on the doll where my politics hurt you. And it's like, oh wait, they don't. And then I offer them the very clear promise in writing, I am not grading you on your opinions. The good news is I'm not grading you on your opinions. The bad news is that means you have to do actual work, because that's what I'm grading you on. And when we've had that conversation, I find that the students who agree with me least on some of the things that matter to me, like, you know, keeping the courthouse doors open to plaintiffs who've been wronged by corporations and things like that matter, where I might disagree with some of my more conservative students. We have great conversations because they know that their opinion doesn't matter like mine doesn't matter. The learning matters and the material matters. And when we make those goals and objectives, we're here to learn and we're here to defend our ideas and build them and make something out of them. It's civil because we're trying to do great work together.
Thank you. Steve, Katja,
Yeah.
I'm sure you both as administrators.
Well, on the administrative side, I would say modeling the notion that the divide can be crossed by hosting events that are sort of designed to be nonpartisan, cross-partisan, and designed in a way to again, model the civility, the civil discourse. President Daniels has a presidential lecture series, and I was sharing outside that a couple of recent guests by design were Ezra Klein and Ben Domenech of the Federalist, you know, two commentators from different sides of the spectrum. And it was a great event, and I think it really, it was great discussion, good debate. They ended up agreeing on a lot. But I think those kinds of things model to students that, well, first of all, exposes them to different points of view in the same place, but then models how civil debate can occur. I think on interacting at the student level, and I'll turn it over to you on this, but I think some of the things that I've seen that are pretty exciting, I'd like to see get started at Purdue. Michael Barr, up at Michigan, the dean of the School of Public Policy there, happens to be a law school classmate of mine. He started this, or was instrumental in starting this group called We Listen, which is a student organization that's specifically designed to create those put on those kind of events and have student dialogue on controversial subjects.
Okay. I'm going to let Katja have the final word, and then I think we're going to go ahead and take questions.
So I'll take sort of a different approach. I was a student at UCSB. I was a staff member and a student again as a doctorate student. And now I'm the dean of students, so I'm a certain level of administrator, but I don't make decisions around faculty or anything. So I'm going to just talk from my level because I know as a student I would be quick to those staff, those faculty, those administrators, and then as I've moved up, I'm like, oh, you have no idea until you are in those shoes. So the shoes that I am currently in, what I recognize is students need to hear from administrators. They need to hear from staff and faculty. They need to feel supported. You need to create spaces for them. And it's all students. As Maria from UCLA says, she's dean, I'm dean. We are deans of all students. And they all come from different backgrounds. They have different ideologies, different political views. And so how do we make sure that there's space for them all to be heard or have events that they want to have? And one thing that I did is because recognizing that the very top administrators, the chancellors or the presidents, they could be a little slower getting out messages that students need to hear as soon as something happens. And it's because of all kinds of policy and reputation and what should they do and consultation. I know our chancellor is very good at consulting with other faculty and administrators before he puts anything out, and that's part of his job. And so what I did a few years ago, after we had a horrific year at UCSB, you heard the question Melissa brought up about the massacre. We also had meningitis. We also had a riot. We had, you name it, we practically had it at that campus. And I learned so much as a dean and how to listen to students and figure out ways in which to support them. And I recognized how slow it was for students to hear from us administrators. So I started a newsletter. And so every month I send out a newsletter, student life newsletter. It's pretty benign. I talk about events that are happening on campus. I tell people to give me information to put out. I quiz students every time I see them. I did that today to my two UCSB students who are here, saying, do you read my newsletter? And people might think because it's just because it has a picture of me and I want to make sure they hear from me. I even started have lunch with the dean to see if anybody would respond, and actually I have. I've had amazing lunches lately with students because of it. But I do it because I can get away with pushing out messages, and they don't even know it. So I start the newsletter with, spring quarter, yay. And if something's happened on campus, there were swastikas on cars. Someone had gone through Isla Vista, the neighboring community, and used their finger to draw these things. I got to address it. I got to share how hurtful that was to a community, to all of us. So it's also being creative and looking for ways to message. So I just wanted to approach that question that way.
Okay, I'd like to open it up to questions. Okay, right here. Sorry, we have to wait for it.
No, I'm sure you all can hear. So seeing that, obviously in academics, we need to see data of how we can show improvement. So for example, like at Purdue with the orientation there, if that model's working, are we able to share some of those things of like the success of those things so that we can see that implemented at more institutions?
Yeah.
For example, for non-conflict resolution, they're doing it at Santa Barbara, they're doing it at Merced, they're doing it at San Diego. Is that something as a UC system that we should be looking at? Like if we're trying to be proactive towards those things, is that something that we should have dialogue about and see if there's progress to be made there? Can we do more of those things and use some of these patterns? If the four of you were to get together, what would be some of those things that you think that we could really use, and what would be some of those starting points?
Okay.
It's a great question and suggestion, and we're about at least a year slow on getting that, but that's going to be our next phase, is to develop some metrics and a longitudinal study. We are already sort of seeing anecdotally the impact on the student body. Can I tell a couple of quick stories? One is that our dean of students, I think after the second year, like a week after the session, the second year we did it, just happened to be out in one of our scenarios is the campus preacher out in the square. She sort of sidled up to watch the interaction, and heard a young student say, "Hey, let's just get out of here. Remember, we learned all about this
Yes.
before the gold rush," and they moved on, like they ignored it. When a couple of years ago, everybody was up in arms. Similarly, I think it might have even been that same year, one Friday, everything was going swimmingly, probably a month later. And all of a sudden, Purdue Police Dispatch started ringing off the hook. Hate and bias reports started coming in. And it was like, why the spike in activity? And it turns out it was homecoming weekend, and it was parents and alumni who were, so it's not just the students, it's the folks from the outside who were complaining about seeing the campus preacher.
Interesting. Anybody else, or can I go to another question? I'm going to try to see if there's people in the back. Okay, go ahead here. You're not in the back, but.
Okay, first, I'll stand, sorry. First, thank you for saying what you said about the impact that speech has on people. The Life Vest analogy was just so poignant, and I really, really liked it. My question for you is, do you think that elevating dialogue within the classroom translates to speech outside the classroom? So, for example, I go to UC Berkeley. If you go down Sproul Plaza, you see all sorts of speech, but the ones that people usually respond to or get bothered by are these like very, for lack of a better word, like sort of like very far right, like alt-right kind of messages that don't seem productive to anyone. And do you think that elevating dialogue within the classroom translates to outside the classroom, or do you think that students are self-selecting to take those classes that elevate the dialogue, are the ones that aren't the problem in the first place?
So,
Yeah, go ahead. No, she doesn't. Go ahead.
So I think there's a lot there, and one thing is that I actually believe that all of us, every professor, whether we talk about it, and I actually don't think professors are great at being explicit about what it is that we want. And I think that's a big problem in academics. I think a lot of students find it to be a mystery. But I think most professors would say, my class is supposed to be about curating sources that you use really good ones to build well-founded opinions and expressing them well. And some people showcase it as what is explicitly their course is supposed to be about, and makes it sort of meta that way, like my speech class does, and some don't. We're all hoping for that same product, and I think people who get involved in academia and involved in education hold this belief that people talking about ideas and challenging them and writing about them will make the world better. I feel that way. So from that, though, I think that actually it's not, if it's not getting to everyone, it's every individual student's responsibility to decide, how do I want to engage? And ask yourself the two threshold questions. What do I want for myself? And what do I demand from myself? And infuse that into your classes, regardless of whether that's the sort of explicit mission of the course or not, or it's the thing that the professor's sort of putting out there. And doing that in your social and community and interpersonal engagements and familial ones too. And I think that that's a tough thing to say, because I feel really strongly that our students are the opposite of snowflakes, that our students are tougher than preceding generations of students. Up to 50% of college students are food insecure in this country. I think 20% of LA community college students are homeless. So I see you, believe in you, I'm here for you, and though it is on you to make decisions about advocating for yourself and asking for, and being effective communicators. Right? And I think part of that is making a decision how you engage with the sort of, alt-right person in the square, or your classmate who thinks that person is amusing when that person might be hurtful to you. And taking that upon yourself and actually asking less of, the deans, the professors, people, please give this unto me, this space to communicate this way. And just doing it yourselves. You're better at it than our generation anyway.
Thank you. Okay,
Like
Ilana,
by a
yeah,
lot.
you had it.
Oh, I was just going to say that, and I think this gets to sort of to the self-selection question, but also to the metrics question, which is, you know, I gave a talk about in my department. We have a small department, and there were only a couple of faculty and a couple of graduate students who came to the talk. This is the end of February, and I was talking about a lot of this stuff and about the book and stuff, and there were a number of sort of criticisms. I actually, when I was talking about this to the class on Viewpoint Diversity, to the Bigots and Snowflakes class, I told them that I said, well, you know, I gave this talk in my department last week or whenever it was, and I said, how do you think that went over? And they're like, yeah, not good, not well. And I said, that's right, it didn't. And so, you know, one of the comments that I got from one of my colleagues was that, you know, he felt like I was painting with too broad of a brush, right? And that, you know, the criticism, frankly, is great. It really, because it makes me sort of think about this stuff more. So he said that I was painting with too broad of a brush, and that in his classes he really didn't feel like that what I was saying sort of was a fair description of how he teaches his classes. Again, so that was his point. And so when I was talking about this, because I used essentially these 4 main comments that were criticisms from that talk, and I brought them into the class, and I said, because part of what we do is we spend a fair amount of time talking about what are the sort of counter arguments to this. And so we went through them, and when we got to this point, and I brought up this point that my colleague had made, you know, and there was a number of students in the class, and particularly one student in particular who I think is a sociology major. At the minimum, he's taken a number of sociology classes. And his first question is, he was like, yeah, who said that? And I was like, I am not going to go there. I was like, I'm not really going to say that, but why? Tell me why. I was like, what are you trying to get at? And he's like, you know, because I've taken a number of sociology classes, and he said they're all the same. He said they are. He said whoever is saying that, they are. That is not. I mean, and there's, yes, it is possible that he has not taken a course with this particular person, although we are a small department. But you know, the point was just that what I'm saying is that there is. I think we need to allow for the possibility that there is dissonance between what people think is the way faculty think that they're teaching, and I'm certainly as guilty of this, I'm sure, as everybody else. I'm not exempt. But what we think we're doing and what we're actually doing. So that was it.
I think we have time for a couple more questions. Okay, right here in the back at this table.
Hi, so my name is Kamyar. I go to UC Merced, and before I pose my question, I wanted to say that I actually work for the Dean of Students at UC Merced, Dr. Jonathan Grady. I have the first and only permanent student position, which is the Director of Student Success and Campus Climate at UC Merced. And similar to your communication newsletter, we did that last year, but this year we're doing kind of like a talk show platform. It's on Instagram, ucm.cc, if you want to take a look.
And you're going to get to your question, though it's all good
Yes,
introduction.
so the question is, and I actually want to be a general counsel one day, so I'm very happy that this panel's here. My question is, UC Merced is only 14 years old. And so, you know, you mentioned the lunches with students, and Stephen, you mentioned the kind of orientation type, teaching of free speech. What kind of measures and instruments should UC Merced put in place now as a young institution to ensure that we're productively addressing free speech?
Who wants to take
We'd be
that?
happy to talk to you about our scripts for our scenarios and show you the approach we take for the panel discussion. I mean, I think that is orienting students with that kind of awareness from the get-go would be something very helpful, I think. I mean, we think it is.
And all of the work that these wonderful panelists are doing is available online, and I'm sure they would be thrilled to share it with you going forward. And I anticipate that there are other people in this room, and I could start calling people out, but I'm not going to do that, who I know are doing great work for universities, for associations that work with universities, for nonprofits, and I would encourage you to connect with each other, because one of the things I've found as I visit UC campuses in my role is that there's a lot of really incredible work that's happening, and people don't know about it within the system, people don't know about it within organizations, and that some of it is filling gaps of work we haven't done, but some of it is being aware, what are the resources that already exist and how can we use them? So I'm going to go with one more question. I'm going to go right here.
So I'm Michaela McNally, I'm from UCSD. I'm actually just going to read this off because I typed it up and it's kind of long. But it shouldn't be a long answer. It has been a running theme today that people say we need to promote a conducive learning environment for underrepresented groups or groups that may feel like their speech has been stifled. And so with that said, acknowledging the liberal bias on campus, do you guys feel like administrations fail to recognize the ostracization that conservatives feel on campus, especially in the classroom where professors often take time to express their hate for Donald Trump or Republicans or conservatives? And often such remarks make it really challenging to give the professor the focus they deserve because the effect it has on their ethos in the eyes of those conservative students. So is this issue ever discussed in administrations or even known?
Thank you for asking that. I think it's a really important question. We talk a lot about diversity, and it was on my list, but not always about viewpoint diversity. I'm going to give you each a chance.
I'll just start real quick. My comment that we're deans of all students, that is important here in terms of hearing from all our students. We actually had some of our conservative students call us out. The vice chancellor and I met with them because when we sent out a communication, they felt like they weren't represented in it. And I thought it was really helpful feedback. And so we really do need to listen to students. So one of the most important things that I do and reflected in my work is to have relationships with students. So I go to events, I talk to students, conservative students, liberal students, all students that represent different organizations, different ethnic backgrounds. And so the way I know how to address that is to actually be in spaces and create relationships with students. So that's what I know I can do as an administrator.
I think that as well, having conversations with your professors, particularly regarding what you're going to be assessed on. You know, what is my grade about? You know, so if you and I had that conversation, you know, you would know, oh, well, you're going to, you know, just have a good logical structure and be professional and support your arguments with you know, credible evidence, things like this. And it would hopefully set your mind at ease, I would think. I think one real challenge is that each student has her own experience of every class and of every professor. And I'll tell you, as a professor, sometimes it's challenging, because let's say I assign, and I have done this, right? An assignment that's like, you know, in a government class, tell me what you would recommend that that Oregon does, the state legislature does, to address like emergency medical care for undocumented people. And I get two papers. I get a bunch of papers, but two of my papers are, one, a rant about how, you know, pharma doesn't feel the burn enough and is bad in corporate, and healthcare is a human right, and blah, blah. And the professor has a pantsuit and she's a neoliberal shill. And the other says like, blah, 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 rapist, immigrant criminals, blah, blah, blah. And these are both the exact same kind of F, right? But only the person who wrote the rapist criminal one and not the like neoliberal shill pharma one might think that she failed because I am of the vast left-wing conspiracy. And that it's on the professor to really explain, well, how did you earn a grade, and what are we about here? What are we doing here, and why, if this wasn't an A, wasn't it? But it also becomes as well the real responsibility of the college student who's an adult to have that conversation about those expectations. What's really happening here between us?
Ilana.
I think, just to your question, I mean, I think there really, frankly, can't be much question that there is an issue in terms of conservative students expressing their points of view. And I'm not obviously speaking from an administrative perspective, and I'm not even actually talking about grading. I'm just saying that in the classroom, and I mean, I've heard it from students. I mean, I just think there's no question. I mean, you could argue about sort of the degree and the frequency or whatever, but I just think there's no question that is pervasive. You know, and I know we're ending, and so I'll just say something really unpopular, but
that's what we're about.
Right. I mean, so why not? I mean, I do think that, and I know this sort of goes against one of the comments that I guess it was Ruth Marcus, I think she made this morning, about, you know, sort of this, someone asked, I guess it was in response to a question about sort of free speech and diversity, equity, and inclusion, and sort of she made the point that she thinks that those two things complement one another and that they go well together. I think that that is overly optimistic. I think that there is an enormous tension that exists, and I could say more about it. We don't have time, but I think there's an enormous tension that is unacknowledged there between those two, I don't know, goals or agendas or whatever. That I think there is a real tension there, So.
Katja or Steve, you have a last word before we finish? I mean, I think the good news and the bad news is that we're out of time. It's bad news because there's so much more to discuss, and the good news is that this is not the end, right? This is the beginning, and we can continue this discussion. Any final words?
I'm good.
Good.
Okay. I want to thank our panelists.